Welcome to the January edition of the Wisconsin Historical Society Press's Book Bites. My name is Odin Jensen, and I am the author of this book, Stories from the Wreckage, a Great Lakes Maritime History inspired by shipwrecks. And tonight I just want to talk a little bit about the book, but also about what the book represents and the ideas behind it. There are a lot of shipwreck books out there, and most of them are good and interesting, but this is a different kind of a shipwreck book in so many different ways. One of the first is that this book is it couldn't have been written without the public investment Wisconsin's had into preserving, studying, and interpreting for the public Wisconsin's more than 600, nearly 700 Great Lakes shipwrecks. The decision made during an early morning committee session of the state legislature in the late 1980s to establish a state underwater archaeology program has continued to pay remarkable dividends, and we'll see that as it goes through. The book itself took more than 10 years of direct time on and off working on it, but it also reflects the work and the investment of many state agencies, of avocational groups, particularly the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeological Society, Great Lakes Shipwreck Society, and just a lot of folks over the years. I've had an opportunity to exercise my voice in the interpretation of it. Anything that is wrong is mine, but the fact that it exists really depends on everybody else. I'm going to try to shift over here to a PowerPoint. Good illustrations in this book and wonderful photographs that I didn't take, but were mostly done by Tamara Thompson, who runs the State Maritime Heritage Program and is a world-class photographer. So this is the cover of the book, and the dedication is significant to me, and I want to pass it on. It's to my father, Captain James Odin Jensen, and all my other shipmates from Alaska and the Great Lakes who sailed on the eternal voyage, but taught me so much before they departed. The picture you have here is not Wisconsin, it's the Seafarers Memorial in Homer, Alaska, which is where I grew up. And the fact that I grew up in Alaska as part of what was really a fisheries frontier, as part of a maritime family of generation after generation of fishermen and dock builders and shipbuilders and mariners, is important to how I think about this book. Most people who write about shipwrecks, it's an abstract thing. It's interesting. It might even be analytical, but they don't have a personal investment in it. But the world I grew up in, danger and tragedy at sea were part and parcel of life. I know many people who didn't come home, and I've had the experience myself of losing a vessel I was the captain of, fishing king crab in 1982. Losing that boat and fishing for a few more years. After that, I took off for Wisconsin to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. I was trying to get as far away from the sea as I could, and Appleton seemed to be a good place for that. Wisconsin seems to be a good place for me as well. It's a very progressive sort of state. The State Wisconsin Historical Society, always the State Historical Society of Wisconsin to me, was established in 1846 before Wisconsin became a state. That's optimism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it. And this is extended into the shipwreck world. Wisconsin State Maritime Preservation Program, and this book really comes out of that office, was established in 1988. Wisconsin has more than 60 shipwrecks on the National Register of Historic Places, that list of important places. That's more than any other state in the United States. Little Wisconsin, a place that people never thought of as being maritime, is in fact among the most maritime. Like I said, I came from Alaska, and that's significant. It was a frontier. It's a vast space. It's a vast space that was going through the same kinds of developments that the Great Lakes were going through in the 19th century. Of course, I didn't realize that when I first came to Wisconsin, but I started to see these parallels. This is not a Great Lakes vessel. This is the boat I grew up on, the Miss Arctic. It sank twice in her career. First in 1963 off of Kodiak. My dad salvaged it and put it back into work. And then over the years, it changed. The technology evolved in it. The vessel that I was captaining in 1981 was different in many respects. And here we see this beautiful night in front of Augustine Volcano with a moonlight in the background and a crab pot on the deck. It's a beautiful day, a beautiful evening, one I'll never forget, because 16 hours later, we were paddling in a life raft for a 90-foot crab boat, getting off of this vessel before it sank. I came to Wisconsin, to Lawrence University, like I said, trying to get away from things. And I thought I had, but a person who, for those of you that know Lawrence in Wisconsin, it's a great school, and it attracts very good students. And I was not a good student in high school, but I told a good story. I read, and they let me in. I was a fish out of water. I came in January. I was the only person that was warm, I think, that January at Lawrence. But I was very homesick, and I would spend time walking along the Fox River or looking down on the locks and dams and seeing the lights at night from the campus. And I would pretend that I was at home because I was homesick, thinking that I was back in the harbors, thinking that I was back at the sea. And what I didn't realize is I didn't need to really imagine this stuff. It was a fact. This is a picture of the Fox River in the late 19th, early 20th century. And here we see that three-masted sailing vessel, sailing scow going through the locks. This place in Wisconsin is in fact and was intimately connected with the Atlantic Ocean and the sea. And that's one of the big parts of this book that sets it apart from other things that a lot of people have written. I see the Great Lakes not as an isolated regional place, although it is that as well, but I see it as part of as the kind of a western part of the grander, larger Atlantic maritime world that, for good and for less good, redefined the essence of our globe and the nature of our country. And the Great Lakes is part of that. The Great Lakes are great. A fifth of the surface water, fresh water in the world, between 5,000 and 10,000 historic shipwrecks. It's a broad range, but any way you count it, there's a lot of them. In Wisconsin, roughly 700, perhaps a few fewer, perhaps a few more, and that doesn't count perhaps the remains or at least the memories of at least 50 in along the Mississippi River, and as well as all kinds of other underwater heritage. It's not just shipwrecks, it's logging docks, it's all kinds of things. It's Native American sites, all part of that story. My book, however, is about the maritime history and about these historic ships in the Wooden Age. I was lucky enough to get in on the ground floor of Wisconsin maritime heritage or underwater archaeology. I wasn't first, but I was in that second group in 1989 and came to work here. I'd been studying at East Carolina University and did my master's degree there. But trying to sell or explain maritime history in Wisconsin was not easy, both internally and externally. When we think of Wisconsin now, culturally, it's cows, at least out in the outside world. It's cheese. It's, of course, the Green Bay Packers, and these things are all true. It's beer, Pabst or Schlitz, but Pabst's really interesting. A beer, one of those Milwaukee beers. We look at it, Pabst Blue Ribbon. But who was Captain Pabst? Captain Pabst started out as a mariner on the Great Lakes. He was an officer on steamboats. He commanded a small vessel that rowed out to try to save people off the burning Niagara in 1856. He leveraged that position to marry a brewer's daughter and ultimately took over the firm and changed the name. So even the things that don't seem maritime in Wisconsin, as it is nationally, really have maritime roots. Imagery, in 20th century, maybe beer and cheese, but if we look back in time and we think about how people were considering Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region in the pioneering periods, it was a different thing. This is an image of an entry to a competition to design a territorial seal for the new Wisconsin Territory, 1837. It didn't win, but it's one of my favorites. And really most of these have a maritime component, but this is worth looking at. In the center, we see this large side wheel steamer with the smokes belching out, going down the lakes. And in front, you see a plow with grain and this blade, this cutting edge steel blade. We look at it from 2021 and we see old. But if you were looking at this in 1837, what you saw was the future. You were seeing the newest technology. You were seeing a prospective Wisconsin that would flourish because of the interaction between lake and land and new technology. Same idea with those that did the Erie Canal in 1825. We've got two guys here, two hairy guys. Of course, Pan on the left representing the fertility of the land, the interior parts of America, and Neptune representing the sea, and that connection between the two that the Erie Canal began to forge. The idea of lake and ocean intertwined really manifested itself early and continued to exercise tremendous influence throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century, of course, culminating in the St. Lawrence Seaway. The imagery, the maritime imagery continues. It's on our flag, and we'll see one of those in a second, and state sails. And this one I have on the left, they evolve over time, but there's always a sailor on it. And this one is from about 1848. And it's significant for many reasons, but why it's important here is, here they have a mariner. It's important enough, the lakes are important enough to have them on the state seal. There's an anchor as well. But it's not just any mariner. There's a blue jacket here, a tarpaulin hat, the scarf. All of these are items that marked the deep water sailor, the Atlantic sailor of the mid-19th century. And the fact that that's what they put on the Wisconsin seal reflects the fact that the guys that were out on the lakes, the culture that was dominating the lakes, were of this grand seafaring tradition. It wasn't a separate lake. It wasn't a different group. That came later. Of course, here's the Wisconsin flag today. Unfortunately, most people don't remember this. They don't know why that sailor is there, and they don't. And history has kind of rewritten over the maritime components of the state's history and of the region's history. But shipwrecks help us rediscover that. Shipwrecks help us rediscover the centrality of the lakes, the importance of maritime vision, and a whole host of other things. We can think about the Great Lakes in a lot of ways. I think about them often as frontiers, and there's all kinds of academic stuff that I have, because I'm a professor now, not a commercial fisherman, so I can get pretty academic-y, but the book isn't pitched that way. But frontiers have meaning. When you look at frontiers, one of the ways you can see them in the maritime environment is when you see aggregates of shipwrecks and changes. It tells you that there's a frontier going on, because frontiers are times of change and a little bit of chaos, and it leads to creativity and disaster. Wisconsin has certainly had a colonial military maritime frontier, but in terms of shipwrecks, it comes to the pioneer and settlement, commercial, lumber, and industrial. And all of this is covered in my book in a variety of ways. And we'll touch on some of that as we go on. This is a chart, and I wish it had the numbers on it, but it didn't come through on my slides. Shipwrecks are really, ships and shipwrecks are really remarkable indicators of change. And so what we are looking at here are representations of all of the ships that wrecked in Wisconsin that we know of, the historic shipwrecks. And the green represents the decade that they were built. And I start with the Erie Canal as my benchmark. And you see there's not many that were built that early, or 1835, but by 1845, 1855 to up through 1865 to 1870, that's when most of the ships were built that wrecked in Wisconsin. There were ships built later and they were bigger and the numbers weren't there. But this reflects the expansion of the West. Shipwrecks tell us about the West in really interesting sorts of ways. And I'll talk more about this, which is the decade of sinking. And you can see there's a big difference and a real pattern. The pioneer settlement frontier period You know, that was before we had, before the state and the region had significant railroads. The road systems were poor, and steamers, but also schooners and other sailing vessels carried a wide range of passengers and commerce. It was commercial. The people were entrepreneurial that were coming out, and they did so by virtue of the lakes. Part of this pioneer period saw the development of massive, elaborate steam passenger vessels. And in fact, the Great Lakes had some of the largest that were being built in the world at that time. It was just a key place for this development. And what we're looking at here are two steamers, historical images of two steamers. Down here on the bottom is the Niagara. It was launched in 1846. It was lost in a terrible, tragic fire off of Port Washington in 1856. There's a lot in the book. I use the Niagara to really explore the entire history of Great Lakes pioneer steam vessels. The Niagara was the second largest passenger steam vessel in the world by tonnage when she was built on the Great Lakes. The largest was the Empire, built in 1844, which was even longer at 260 feet and huge, with a 200-foot gallery and all. These were really cutting-edge things. They were important icons of the place. You'll note that this image, which is extremely accurate, is the face of a march, of a quick step, of a music that was commissioned for the launching of the Empire. People from around the world took, yep.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Can you share your screen one more time? I don't think it's going through.
Oh, no. Okay. I'll try again.
Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm having problems with it. It is not, what is going on here? I apologize for this, but it won't do it. Hang on. Okay. I don't really know what to say. It's not, I can't seem to get it to share on the Zoom. Okay, hang on. Maybe I got it. Should be okay now. I'm going to have to quit and reopen. So please bear with me, and I apologize for technical difficulties beyond my control. I'll be right back. So I think I'm back, and we shall try to share screens here. Oh, you need to add me as a host again.
You should be a co-host now.
Okay. We will try this again. So is that working now? Okay, well, sorry that I didn't know that earlier. Anyway, back to describing visuals, looking at these grand vessels that were really some of the finest in the world, and they took, people noticed it. One of the voices that's in my book is from this gentleman up here, Alexander Stevenson, actually David Stevenson. The name Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson, you've heard of from Treasure Island. He was the disappointment of the family. The Stevensons were important because they were the most prolific and innovative lighthouse builders in the United Kingdom. And this guy, when he was young in 1837, came over to tour America when he finished his education. And he toured America, which people tended to do. It's kind of a finishing school kind of thing. Went to see the various parts of this developing country, east, west, and south. And he did it with an engineer's eye and a maritime engineer's eye at that. And he talked about the lakes, about the fact that vessels, these steam vessels, that as a class, he said, they evidenced, quote, in greater degree the character of sea boats. That Stevenson attributed these characteristics to the requirements imposed by the, quote, severe storms and formidable waves found in the Western lakes. In short, Stevenson saw, as the shipbuilders that we studied understood, they saw the lakes not as a domestic lake, they saw it as a genuine inland sea, a place of oceanic proportions and danger and opportunity. And the vessels really reveal that from this period. It's one of the things that the archaeology underscores and makes clear to us again. It was a commercial frontier, again, sailing vessels, and I don't have time to get into all of those, but they carried many different things in this early period. Later, it became more bulk goods. One of the frontiers, and this actually connects really well with Jerry App's book bites from, I think, last month or the month before, on the lumber frontier. Just as there was a lumber frontier on land, there's a lumber frontier on the lakes. This is an example of a lumber carrier. You can see the lumber products stacked really high. And when we analyze the collective shipwreck heritage of Wisconsin, the cargo that's most common are forest products of one kind or another. The amount of lumber that was carried was vast, and the presence of wood also affected the nature of ships and shipbuilding, and that's all covered in the book too as part of an environmental history. It was an industrial frontier, and really the coming of the industrial frontier, while it led to the development of new kinds of ships and vessels, it also created tremendous pressures that led to an increase in shipwrecks. By the beginning of the 20th century, the lakes had emerged as the world's most efficient industrial waterway. It was part of a complicated system, and really we could look at the Great Lakes as part of the foundation of American military and economic power. When you link up what was being produced in the mines and what was being grown in on the farms, together, all of these things made the Great Lakes for a time the busiest ports in the world by tonnage, not in value, not in people, but in just raw materials that passed through. They were extremely important. This gets back to shipwrecks and shipwrecking. This does have numbers on it. And the thing to see is the peak decade of shipwrecking, and peak decades is in this period where we're transitioning after 1875, really about 1880 or so, through the early part of the 20th century, the coming of industrialization, and what that brought. It brought profit, it brought many things, but it brought a lot of hardship and danger to the lakes. Industrial capitalism is not a very kind master at sea. And this is an example of that. This is one of the stories I talk about in the book. This is James Corrigan. He was a major industrialist, he and his brother, in Cleveland. Started out, went on the lakes early, made his first money there, kept buying boats, but made quite a name for himself. He and his brother in the oil industry. He was a friend of John D. Rockefeller. In the early mid 1880s, with the development of iron mining on Lake Superior, he started buying wooden ships and using them to haul ore, wooden sailing ships. These are two of them, Tasmania and others. and older ships as well. He had a penchant for buying older vessels, insuring them heavily, and just putting them out to sea, to do his bidding. And the results were pretty horrifying in many ways. By the 1820s, or excuse me, by the 1890s, he was losing vessels almost as fast as he was buying them. Over half of the vessels that he bought in his career sank, many of them with all hands, including this one, the Niagara, which is up in Lake Superior. We did a lot of work on that, and the story is pretty fascinating in the book. We've got the archaeology and the history on it. But it turns out, and when we worked on the Niagara in 1990 to start with, we thought about it really in the terms of the Niagara itself. What the research on this book revealed was it was just one of many. There were many vessels just like her that was owned by Corrigan that sank with all hands. In his writings and talking about seasons, he would talk in Darwinian terms about survival of the fittest, and indeed, many of his crews, disappeared with all hands. Things caught up with him, a sort of a karmic sense, and he had a yacht that he bought, he and his brother, that had been an America's Cup, early America's Cup yacht. And they went out on a trip, and he and his brother got off, and they had a captain who was actually not that competent, and they had a terrible accident, and 6 of his family died, including his wife, his daughters, grandchildren, and all of that. Really a really terrible thing. I always wonder what he thought, if he ever thought about the families of the people that he employed that died in his service. I end the chapter as this, because I'll read a little bit about it. This is a chapter called The Survival of the Fittest. The purpose of this chapter is not to vilify James Corrigan. He was a tough man in a rough age, and he paid a horrible price. Rather, the larger point is to highlight how rapid industrialization in the Great Lakes between 1880 and the mid-1900s amplified the dangers faced by mariners, especially those caught up in an iron trade under a ruthless owner. Shipwrecks were a fact of life in the Great Lakes throughout the 19th century, and other major ship owners during the early industrial era might have had safety records as bad as Corrigan's. However, over the course of his career, from the first schooners purchased in the 1870s till his death in 1908, he became the principal owner of at least 30 ships. Nearly 2/3 were lost in his service. His grim record of individual vessel accidents, when looked at as a whole, were no accident. He routinely bought old ships at the lowest possible prices and drove them hard. While the heavily insured Corrigan remained protected against maritime disaster, his men risked their lives in heavily loaded, poorly maintained craft. It was a cold and terrible approach to a man who believed in the survival of the fittest. Well, we're running a little bit short of time, and I hope this gives you a bit of a taste of the book. It really puts things into a cosmopolitan context, looking at the broader implications of the lakes, trying to reveal that, in fact, it was an international place during the 19th century and early 20th century. 1870s, people American born were in a minority. And the stories in the book are surprising in many ways. People who were Great Lakes sailors and maritime entrepreneurs whose gaze moved well beyond the Great Lakes to, in the case of these two guys, as far as the Indian Ocean on sailing vessels. So I don't have time to talk all about that, but this is a taste of it. So if you want to read about a maritime history that puts the Great Lakes into an international and national context, that also keeps the eye on the human side of the maritime story, that to remember that that shipwrecks are about people, and that when we think about ships and shipping or shipwrecks, we should move beyond just thinking about the wreck itself. The shipwreck is typically the least important thing in a vessel's career. Shipwrecks can tell us about the rest of it. I'll close again with the Seafarers Memorial, because again, when I write these things, I see the people, I remember things, and it's worth remembering, and it's one of the reasons why I think what Wisconsin Historical Society and its many partners have done is so very important. Thank you very much.